Okay, so getting into this next set of videos, we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 13, which is going to get into advanced controls with JavaFX. So we already looked in Chapter 12 at some of the more basic or fundamental concepts of JavaFX. Now we're going to start taking a look at some additional controls. So we saw buttons, labels, and text fields in the previous chapter. Now we're going to be looking at things like radio buttons, checkboxes, sliders, text areas. We'll even see things like list views, menus, and the file chooser, so the ability to browse for a file. In addition to these advanced controls, we're also going to be taking a look at being able to add some style to our applications with what are known as cascading style sheets, or CSS. So that'll be the first thing we look at, is this CSS. We'll be taking a look at that in this first video and a couple more after this. After we get through that, then we'll start getting into each one of those different advanced controls. So to start off with, we're going to get into styling JavaFX applications with CSS. So CSS is going to be short for cascading style sheets. This is going to be a style sheet language that specifies the appearance of an application. So most of the time when I talk about CSS, you might hear me use that phrase style sheets, talking about a single CSS file. I just refer to it as a style sheet. The structure of the application is going to be specified with a programming or markup language. So in the case of a programming language, that would be something like Java to create our JavaFX applications. HTML, so the language that's used for creating web pages, that's a markup language. So in either one of those cases, whether you're making JavaFX applications or you're creating web pages, you are going to use CSS to style those. So the general rule here is that what is displayed is specified in Java, and then how it is displayed is specified in CSS. So CSS is going to consist of one or more style sheets with these style definitions. So we're going to be defining the style in our appearance, the style in our application window. Style definition includes a selector to indicate what elements will be styled. So you need to select some elements or some controls in your applications. You're going to do that with a selector of some kind. And then in the body of the selector are going to be your style rules. So these are going to be the rules about how you want to style it. The style rules are going to be in the form of a property to style, so a specific characteristic that you want to apply some style to, and then a particular value for how to apply that style. So essentially just saying, this is what I want it to look like. So breaking down each of those different parts of our CSS selectors. So the first thing is going to be the selector name itself. So we've got an example here with the three controls that we've seen so far, our button, label, and text field. So if we take a look on the right-hand side, we've got the corresponding CSS selector for each of those three controls. So with our button, we've got this dot and then button. So anytime that we want to specify a selector for a particular class or a particular type selector, we're going to use that dot and then the name of it. So in this case, the first one's going to be doing it for button. You'll also notice that the name button in CSS is in all lowercase. This is also going to be the same for label. So we see dot label, and it's going to be in all lowercase when we do it in CSS. And then for text field, we're going to do dot text dash field. So when we need to separate out the words, text and field, we're going to use a hyphen between them. So CSS is going to offer various style properties to modify how our content is going to be displayed. So here are a couple of examples of some style properties. So we've got our label, we have dot label for the selector, we then have that pair of curly braces for the body of the selector, and then inside of there we can see a couple of different rules in the form of a property, then a colon, and then a value that we want to apply to that property. So we've got this first one, -fx-font-family. So this is specifying the font family for the text. In this case, we want to specify it as cursive. The next one's going to be -fx-font-size. So this is going to be specifying the font size, essentially how big we want the text to be. So we're specifying the value for this to be 14 points. We then have -fx-font-style. So this is to specify some kind of styling or some additional styling with our font. In particular, this is used to specify if we want it to be italicized or not. So we're going to set it to italic. -fx-font-weight. This is going to be for the font weight, which is basically describing how thick you want the text to be. Essentially, it's the distinction between either bolded or unbolded text. And then this last one that we're using in this example is -fx -border -style. So this is to add some additional styling to a border. So a border is going to be, if you imagine every one of your controls to be in a box, so kind of similar to those rough sketches that I would show, the border is essentially the outline of that box. So in this case, we're specifying a dotted outline for what's going to go around our labels. So now that we've seen a little bit about how we're going to go about writing these selectors in our CSS files, we also need to make sure that there's some connection between the Java file and the CSS file. So we need to make sure that whenever we open up our JavaFX application, that it understands where its styling is going to be coming from. So to do that, we're going to need to get our scene, and we're going to specifically need to get these style sheets being applied to that scene. So we're going to use this getStyleSheets method. That will give us a list of all the style sheets currently being applied to it. So when we're first adding some new style to it, that list is initially going to be empty. So we're going to put a single style sheet into it. So we're going to use the add method to do that. So we can see right there that .add. And then the particularly interesting part of this statement is going to be what we need to put into that add method. So I've broken down each one of the three methods we're going to be using in there. So we're going to be using getClass, getResource, and toExternalForm. So the getClass method is going to return the runtime class of an object. So it's basically just telling you what class that object comes from, specifically when the application is running. In a moment you'll see why it is that at runtime is going to be so important. And then this method is implicitly called on the this reference. So it's basically the equivalent if I had done this.getClass. If that particular syntax that I'm showing doesn't really make a lot of sense right now, don't worry. That will be clarified a little bit later when I talk more about using the this reference or the this keyword in Java. So for now, essentially we can just imagine that we've got our Java file with our JavaFX application code inside of it. So getClass is basically just going to give us that class that's in that file. And the reason that we're going to need that is so that we can then use getResource to go fetch some resource that is associated with that class, specifically some resource that is in the same directory as that class. So the getResource method is going to find a resource with some given name. So you can see in this example we have that string with mystyles.css. So we're going to go look for a resource, basically a file with that name. So we're going to use it to fetch the CSS file that will be applied to this JavaFX application. One thing to note about getResource is that the resource is going to be returned as a URL object. So there's a little bit of a problem with that, which is that URL objects are different from strings, and the add method for getStyleSheets is expecting a string. So what we need to go ahead and do is convert that URL object to a string, and that's where the toExternalForm method comes in. So the toExternalForm method is going to return the string representation of the URL object because of the fact that the add method was expecting a string. So this is going to be necessary for compatibility purposes. And one last thing I want to note before we get into the code. So I kind of hinted at this, precisely where this style sheet or this CSS file is going to need to be located. So I mentioned that when we use getResource, we're going to be looking for a resource that's in the same directory as our Java file, as that class. So style sheets are going to be assumed to be in the source directory by default. So that means that they're going to be in the same folder as our Java file itself. So this is a little bit different from, say, image files, like you might have seen in chapter 12, where those were by default assumed to be in the project directory. Same thing with text files. If you're doing something like print writer or scanner to write to or read from a text file, those are also assumed to be in the project directory. But in the case of CSS files, these are going to be assumed to be in the source directory. And then one other thing to note is that styling is going to be applied at runtime. So this is where I mentioned that the fact that we're looking at the runtime class of an object, why that's so important. So the reason that that's pretty interesting, or why that's meaningful to us, is because our styling is being applied at runtime. And what this means for us is that if we modify something in our style sheet, so we change something in the code of our CSS file, we don't have to recompile our application. We only have to rerun it to see the changes to that style. And then one last thing I'll note here is that if you want to see everything that's available for JavaFX CSS, you can check out the reference guide. I will say now that there is no way I could possibly go through all of it. It is very long. There's a lot of different style properties. But to just give a brief overview of this, we'll quickly open this up. So if you take a look at this, it's the Oracle documentation for the CSS reference guide. So this is coming straight from the company itself that manages Java. If you start to look through this list, you can start to see all the different parts in the contents of this documentation. One thing I will note, if you look over at the navigation bar, you can start to immediately see just how long this documentation is. Probably the part that you'll be most interested in when you first start out taking a look at any of this documentation, if you're actually interested in it, is probably going to be this controls section. So we can go ahead and just jump straight to that. And from here you can take a look at a couple of different classes to set up some CSS classes, so some selectors to be able to apply some styling to these different kinds of controls. And then you can also see maybe some of the different properties that you want to work with on them. So you can go through all of that if you'd like. So yeah, so you can see right here with the label, it goes through all of these different properties that you could use. So we're going to take a look at a couple of these, but I won't be trying to go through every single one of them. Alright, so now that we've seen all of that, we'll go ahead and go over to NetBeans and try to put together a little bit of code to take a look at this. So we'll go ahead and remove that. Go ahead and create a new project. We'll make this a new JavaFX application. Go ahead and click Next. So for a project name, let's go ahead and make this just a quick demonstration of how to use a little bit of CSS. So I'll call this our CSS demo. Go ahead and click Finish. So this will go ahead and give us our Java file. So if we open up our source packages and we go into the one package we have at the creation of this project, we can see that Java file right there. So we'll go ahead and clean up this little bit of code that we have. We'll remove all the things that we're not going to need. So all of these extra comments that I won't be using. Go ahead and adjust the styling. Go ahead and remove all of the default code that it gives us in the start method, since we won't really need most of that. We'll also go ahead and remove this comment on the main method. Make a little adjustment there. And then we'll also go ahead and move the main method to the beginning of the program. Oops. Okay. The other thing we'll go ahead and do is remove the extra imports that we're not going to use. So we'll get rid of action event and event handler. We'll also go ahead and get rid of button and stack pane. And then we'll go ahead and add in the ones that we do want to use. So for this one, I just want to go ahead and create a label. So I can go ahead and add a little bit of styling to that. We'll take a look at those properties that we saw in one of the examples on the slides. We'll also go ahead and create an HBox, since we need a container to put this control inside of. And that container can also go ahead and be the root node of the scene. So we're going to do import javafx.scene.control.label. We'll also go ahead and do import javafx.scene.layout.hbox. Okay. And then right here, we will start off by creating our label. So we'll go ahead and make it something of class label. For the name for this, we'll go ahead and just call it label in all lowercase. So equal to a new label. And then right here, for the text inside of this label, let's just go ahead and call it something like Hello World. And exclamation point, and we'll save that. So that'll be the text that we display inside of our label. We'll then go ahead and just create our HBox. So I'll just go ahead and do that right underneath it. This will be HBox in all lowercase, so equal to a new HBox. And the only thing I want to put into that HBox is going to be my label. The next thing I'm going to need is to create my scene. So of our scene, we'll call it scene in all lowercase. For this one, we're going to go ahead and put in the HBox. And just to make sure that this is at least a little bit more visible or a little bit clearer, I'll give it a little bit of extra height and width for the dimensions. So we'll do something like 150 by 150. It won't be very large. And then the last part we're going to need is to set our scene, set up our title, and then make sure that our application window is actually displaying. So we'll go ahead and do primary stage dot set scene. And then right here, we're going to go ahead and put in that scene. Then do primary stage dot set title. And right here, we'll put in CSS demo as our title for this application. And then very last line, do primary stage dot show. Go ahead and save that. And then if we go ahead and run this application, so we get our little box right here, admittedly so small we can't even see the title, but we have our text right here, hello world, so that's going to be the most important part for us. So now that we can see this text and we see that everything's displaying the way that we expect it to, we can go ahead and start adding some style to this. So go ahead and close this, and then we'll go ahead and create that style sheet. So by style sheet, I'm talking about the CSS file. So to add that CSS file, we want to go to the CSS demo package, so this right here. So you want to go ahead and right click on that. We're going to go to new, and if you happen to have it already, it'll just be cascading style sheet right here. If this isn't already listed in this part of this drop down menu, you're going to want to go to other, so we'll go ahead and open that up. So that's going to open up this little dialog window. So we'll see categories right here. So we're going to scroll down in categories to the very bottom. We're going to go to this other folder right here, choose that. And then in file types, we're going to come down a little bit. We're going to see this cascading style sheet. We're going to go ahead and select that and then click next. And so then this will allow us to create our CSS file. So a pretty standard convention for the name that I like to use is to call it just style in all lowercase. So we'll go ahead and put that for the name. You're not going to need to put the .css because of the fact that we already specified it as a cascading style sheet as a CSS file in the previous window. It's just going to add that by default, or just recognize that that's what we want. So we'll click finish. So you can see right here it's style.css. It's going to go ahead and open this up in our text editor. It started off with some extra comments. So we've got that license header, kind of like what we see on our Java files. We've also got this created on date and this author. So one thing I'll note before I remove all this, if you want to be able to add comments to a CSS file, the primary way you're going to be doing that is with multi-line comments. So you're going to be using essentially the same characters that you see in Java to create a multi-line comment. So you're going to see this /* and then */. So same general format for that. But I'm not going to worry about adding comments. I'm just going to go ahead and remove this. And what I'm going to go ahead and add here is going to be the that bit of code that we saw on the slides where we were selecting the label and then applying a couple of different properties to it. So we were doing things like the family, the size, the style, the weight, and then the border style. So we're going to go ahead and apply all of those rules to it. So the first thing we need is our selector. So in this case, we're doing a type or a class selector. So we're doing .label. We then have that pair of curly braces to start the body of our selector. And then inside of here, we're going to specify each one of those different properties and the value that we want to apply to that property. So the first one was our FX font family. We're going to do cursive for this. So one thing I'm going to note before I move on to the rest of them, I will say now that even though I'm adding this, there's a good chance that it's not going to be applied simply because there are some font families that are not immediately recognized, and sometimes it even depends on precisely the machine that you're working on if those font families will be recognized. So in most cases, you will you might not necessarily see any change with this. It really kind of depends. There's certain other specifications you might have to provide as well, but I won't worry too much about getting into the details with that, since that starts to get into more complicated topics related to specifically CSS. And I'll try to keep this mostly focused on programming these applications rather than worrying about specifically styling them. Anyways, so moving on to the rest of them. So we've got FX font size. So we're going to use this to modify how large or how small we want the text to be. We set it to 14 points in the example. We then have our FX font style. So we'll do italic for this. So this will italicize our text, kind of like what it's doing to each one of these properties. We're then going to do FX font weight. So this will be used to make the text bold. So we'll go ahead and specify that here. And then finally, we were going to do something with the border. So we're going to do FX border style, and we're going to make it dotted. So we'll have that dotted border around our label. All right, so now that we've got all of our CSS code, we've got our selector, our body with our different rules inside of it, we'll come back over to our Java file, and inside of here, after we've created our scene, we need to include that line of code to connect our Java code and our CSS code together. So we need to kind of link them together in some way. So we're going to use the scene to do this. So we're going to do our scene object, all lowercase, .add style sheets. One thing to note about this, you might think that style and sheets are like two separate words. This is actually treated as one single word. So this S right here, remember that it is lowercase. So we're going to do add style sheets, or get style sheets for this first method. And then from there, we want to use the add method on it. So do scene.getStyleSheets.add, and then inside of this add method is where we need to do all of that coding that we have. So we're going to get the class, get the resource from the class, and then convert it to a string. So we'll do get class. We'll then do another dot. We'll do get resource. And in this case, it's going to be a string. And the name of the resource we're trying to get is this style.css. So that's what we're going to go ahead and put here. And then finally, we want to take the URL object that it's giving us, convert that to a string. So we're going to use to external form. And that'll give us all of the code that we need for this. So we'll go ahead and save that, and we'll go ahead and run it. And we should see all of the style being applied to our label. So we can see that right here. So we've got hello world, but it is now slightly larger, so that font size, change it to 14 points. It is now italicized, so you can see that slant that's been added to it. It's now been bolded, so you can see that the characters in the text are slightly thicker, and it's also added a dotted border around it, so you can see that additional border style being applied to it. So I'll go ahead and close this. And at this point, this is going to wrap up this introduction to JavaFX CSS. Going into the next video, we want to start talking about another aspect of our properties, which is primarily going to be dealing with colors in CSS.